أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد بن عبد الله وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الأرجاس وطهرهم من الأدناس وجعل مودتهم أجرا على الناس ولا سيما على بقية الله في الأرضين الإمام المنتظر صاحب الزمان عجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف ابن هداة المهديين وعلى صحبهم الأخيار المنتجبين وعلى جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين والشهداء والمجاهدين في سبيل الله منذ آدم إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، روي عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم أنه قال: مثل العقل في القلب كمثل السراج في وسط البيت. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. We've gathered here on this evening on the occasion of the celebration of Imam Ali al-Hadi alayhi salam, since his birth date is due to be in a couple of days, the 15th of Dhul Hijj. Although according to other riwayat, the more popular ones, the date of his birth is said to be slightly later in the holy month of Dhul Hijjah, on the 25th. And other historians also quote the month of Rajab to be that which marks his birth. However, whenever we remember these personalities in history, we find that these momentous individuals had something about their characteristics, had one particular trait within their characteristics that often was outstanding when compared to the rest of their personality. So, for example, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam is known primarily for his bravery, although his personality was not confined to that trait. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, as a result of the tragic events of Karbala, is known for his readiness to sacrifice, for example. His son, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, is known for his devoutness in worship, in secluded worship at that. And the list goes on. And so, our 10th holy Imam, Imam Ali al-Hadi alayhi salam, one trait that sticks out or is more outstanding than the others was his intelligence in judgment, especially so at a young age. So his ability to intellectualize and his immense knowledge in that respect. The Abbasid Caliph at that time, Al-Mu'tasim, at the death or martyrdom of his father, he assigned a teacher to look over and supervise the education of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam in order that he might be indoctrinated with the Abbasid ideology. His name was Al-Junaidi, the teacher who had been appointed, Al-Junaidi. Al-Junaidi has been reported that once when a man came to him and asked him about the young boy at that time who was our 10th holy Imam alayhi salam, that what is the progress of this young boy now? Al-Junaidi replied to him that don't dare call him a young boy. This in fact is a Shaykh. Al-Junaidi, the historian's report, said, Inni wallah la'adhkuru al-haraf fil adab, that I start elaborating on a particular aspect or one part of literature. وَأَظُنُّ أَنِّي قَدْ بَلَغْتُ, and then I think that now I've conveyed the lesson. ثُمَّ إِنَّهُ يُمْلِي أَبْوَابًا أَسْتَفِيدُهُ مِنْهُ. Then once I think I've completed the teaching, he begins dictating and coming out with fields of knowledge that I start benefiting from. فَيَظُنُّ النَّاسُ أَنِّي أُعَلِّمُهُ. So people think that I'm actually teaching him. وَأَنَا وَاللَّهِ أَتَعَلَّمُ مِنْهُ. Whilst in fact by God I'm learning from him. So here we see from Al-Junaidi's statement that Al-Junaidi was teaching Imam, or was trying to teach Imam, he thought he was teaching Imam what he knew. And he could restrict his teaching only to what he knew. Imam alayhi salam was coming out with something new. So just to bear this point in mind throughout the remainder of today's discussion, that Junaidi was teaching him something which he had been nurtured with and taught over history, over the last few years of his life. Imam alayhi salam was coming with something new that Junaidi, as an older person, was not aware of, yet he was benefiting from that. So when we talk about the intellect, one aspect of the human being that we often neglect or often hamper its freedom and its ability to nourish is the aql. Now in these hadith that we're going to look at in the next few minutes, again I think throughout the slides, al-aql has been translated as intellect, but as we will discuss, this is a wholly inaccurate translation or understanding. The first one, مَثَلُ الْعَقْلِ فِي الْقَلْبِ, as the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, that the likeness or the example of the intellect, well, the aql, in the heart, كَمَثَلِ السِّرَاجِ فِي وَسَطِ الْبَيْتِ, is like that of a lamp in the middle of the house. Now when we understand it, we have to bring our minds back to the prophetic era. There was no electricity and tube lights and fluorescent lighting, and how would the companions of the Holy Prophet have taken this narration or these words? In what context? Obviously there was not this kind of lighting. Any light that came into the house was either natural light or in the evening or in the night would have been by the lamps that they had available, whatever fuel they were using. And that fuel also was not easy to come by. In the night time, one lamp would be in the center of the house, and its radiance or its brightness would however much it may have been, would illuminate the rest of the house. In that context, if a person was to cover that lamp or hinder its radiance, the radiance's ability to illuminate the house, what would be the situation in that house? A very gloomy, dark setting, if a person was able to see at all. So the understanding of the aql in the human being or in the heart is that if it's hampered in that way, the entire heart is gloomy or dark. So what is this aql that we are supposed to give it freedom to be lit and to be bright? As we said, often it's translated as the intellect, and in these slides I think it is translated throughout as the intellect for want of a better translation, but that is not wholly correct. Intellect, when we speak about intellectuals can be anyone, regardless of their nearness to Allah or their distance from Allah or their religion or their theological beliefs or their piety, etc. Could be Muslim, non-Muslim, theist, atheist, monotheist, polytheist. They can be intellectuals. Intellectualizing and concluding that 1 + 1 = 2, is this what's meant by the aql, or is the aql something far beyond this? So if we look at how the narrations from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his holy Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam look at the concept of al-aql, or what we've translated as the intellect wrongly if you like, and how they describe this aql. So for example, the first narration we look at is from Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. لما خلق الله العقل قال له, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first created the intellect, the aql, He said to it, أقبل فأقبل ثم قال أدبر فأدبر. So first He created the intellect. Then He said to it, come forth, approach, and it did so. Then He said to it, now go back, and it did so. So first of all, we can see that this entity, whatever it is, this aql is something which in its nature is obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The aql in its essence, in its nature, is something which is obedient to Allah. When Allah says come forth, it comes. When it says go back, it goes back. It is obedient. So it's something beyond just intellectualizing. Imam alayhi salam continues in this narration and he says, فَقَالَ, Allah said to this intellect then, وَعِزَّتِي وَجَلَالِي, by my might and my majesty, مَا خَلَقْتُ خَلْقًا أَحْسَنَ مِنْكَ, I have not created any creation better than you. إِيَّاكَ آمِرُ وَإِيَّاكَ أَنْهَى, it is by you, and it is you that I command, and it is you that I forbid. وَإِيَّاكَ أُثِي وَإِيَّاكَ أُعَاقِبْ, it is you that I give reward, and it is you that I punish. So one, the aql in its nature is something which is obedience to Allah. Two, the aql in its nature is that which is being commanded and forbidden and prohibited in doing certain things. And it is this aql which is accountable and which is given reward or punished on the basis of this aql. It's something beyond 1 + 1 = 2. Furthermore, in another narration from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Imam alayhi salam says, Al-aql munazzahun anil munkar. It is something far transcendent, far above. Again, we've translated here as intellect, but it's not the intellect as we understand it conventionally. It's something far beyond doing evil deeds. Amirun bil ma'ruf, and it is that thing which within the human being that prompts and commands a human towards doing good things. One, it is obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Two, it is the basis for accountability and the basis of reward and punishment. Three, it is far above and transcendent above doing evil. And four, it is that thing in the human being that prompts a person towards doing good. Furthermore, from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam once again, Al-aql sahibu jaysh al-Rahman. It is this intellect, or this aql rather, which is the commander or the possessor of Ar-Rahman's army, of the All-Merciful's army. Wal-hawa, in contrast, the whimsical desires, qa'idu jaysh al-shaytan, is the leader of Satan's army. Al-aql wa-shahwa ضدان. The intellect and the carnal desires are opposite to each other. One, the aql is obedient to Allah by its nature. Two, the aql is the basis for punishment and reward and accountability. Three, al-aql is far above detestable actions. Four, the aql is that which prompts a person towards doing good. Number five, it is that thing in the human being which opposes the carnal desires. And in addition to that, again, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, إِنَّمَا الْعَقْلُ التَّجَنُّبْ مِنَ الْإِثْمِ. It is the intellect, or the aql rather, which is abstaining from wrongdoing. So a person who is drowning themselves in wrongdoing, in sinning, in disobeying Allah, can they be called an intellectual in the terms of what we mean by when we say aql? Not intellectual in the conventional sense of the word. For example, if a person goes through the academic system, schooling and university, and attains undergraduate degrees and then postgraduate degrees and then doctorates, and accumulates these things, does that make them an intellectual? Does that make them aqil rather, even if they may be considered intellectual? For those of you who may be accustomed or familiar with the comedy sitcom The Big Bang Theory, if a person becomes Sheldon Cooper, does that make them aqil? Even if he has 3 doctorates and whatever else he may have, does that make them aqil in that sense? More often than not, it is this aql that we don't let that lamp, as we discussed in the first prophetic narration, burn free in the middle of that house. It's subjugated. Either subjugated and hindered in being brightly lit by a person's carnal desires, or by their ego, as we may discuss a bit later on. Often we even find it is one's temperament, their mood, that hinders this aql and makes a person make a wrong judgment call. And the classic example of this, you may have heard it time and again, is, for example, when a person walks into a supermarket, they may buy whatever they need, whatever's on the shopping list, and they walk out. But bring them to that same supermarket in the month of Ramadan 2 hours before the time of iftar, and that shopping list will become longer than it's supposed to be, and they'll buy something in addition to what's on the shopping list, some frozen dessert that won't be eaten for the next 2 months. Why? Because in that place of hunger and the desire for food, the aql is hindered into making a wrong judgment call. On the same note, if we look at the book, the seminal work by Shahid al-Thani, he says in his book, advising the mujtahid, or the mufti rather, the person who gives religious edicts, he says, ينبغي, that person, ينبغي أن لا يفتي في حال تغير خلقه, that person ought not to issue religious verdicts, fatwa, in a state or in a situation whereby his demeanor would be altered and changed. وَشُغْلِ قَلْبِهِ, and his heart is preoccupied with something else. He should not be giving religious edicts in that situation. وَحُصُولِ مَا يَمْنَعُهُ مِنْ كَمَالِ التَّأَمُّلِ, or in that kind of setting whereby he is prevented from thinking in a complete, wholesome, perfect manner. He may be preoccupied with something. He should avoid giving fatwa in that manner. Like what? He goes on to say, كَغَضَبٍ, like being in a state of anger, he should not give a fatwa in that state. وَجُوعٍ وَعَطَشٍ, or in hunger or in thirst. وَحُزْنٍ, or in sorrow. That mufti, should avoid giving a religious edict and a fatwa in that situation. Why? Because they're not in their normal state of mind, and that will affect their judgment. And he goes on, وَفَرْحٍ غَالِبٍ, an overwhelming kind of delight and happiness, not only sorrow. If a person is overly happy about something, he should not be making judgments on that situation, because his judgment will be something other than what he would do in a normal situation. وَنُعَاسٍ وَمَلَالَ, and in situations of drowsiness, or when he's bored, like some people might be in this lecture, you should avoid making judgment in this situation. Why? Because a person in that situation makes a judgment call which they would otherwise not make. Why do you think it is? Why do we think it is that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says and advises his son, أُوصِيكَ بِالْعَدْلِ, that I advise you to be just. Not only I advise you to be just, عَلَى الصَّدِيقِ وَالْعَدُوِ, when faced or when you're making a judgment on your friend. And Imam alayhi salam could have just said, be just. Being just means being just in all situations. Why does he specify that to the friend and the foe, to the friend and the enemy? Because when faced with a friend, our judgment might be more favorable. When faced with an enemy, our judgment might be something other than it should have been in a just fashion. فِي الرِّضَى وَالْغَضَبِ, also when you're very pleased or happy, and when you're angry, your judgment should be just and fair. So he specifies this. Why does he just not leave it as the first sentence, أُوصِيكَ بِالْعَدْلِ? No, that's enough. I advise you to be just. No, but he specifies. Because the aql is sometimes hampered into making a wrong decision. When it's faced with a situation, there may be bias, there may be discrimination. So is this aql able to be objective, the unhindered aql, when not faced with the hindrances of the soul or the ego, for example? A man comes home, he's had a stressful day at work, very difficult day at work. He comes home, the kids are messing about, the house is dirty, dinner might be slightly undersalted, and he reacts in a way whereby with anger. Has he left the situation at work and then come home and made his aql objective in judging the situation at home? Or is something affecting him? That's how cunning the soul can be. That we think we're making an intellectual judgment whereby we're not using the aql. Why do we think it is that every mother sees her own son as the most handsome son, or her daughter as the prettiest or the most beautiful? Is it possible for every single human being to be, talking about outer appearances, is it possible for every single male human being to be the most handsome? No. Yet every mother may see it this way, because she is looking from a biased perspective. And so we find often when it comes to discussions of an intellectual academic setting, especially that of a religious basis where we see in certain settings, often the ego has formed an identity with what one believes, and therefore when someone challenges a person's theology or ideology, it is no longer my ideology which is being challenged. It is me, because I have been made one and the same due to my ego. When someone brings a quote-unquote academic theory against the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, often become emotional. How can a person say this? We know the Prophet, when the emotion gets into it, you know that I'm no longer talking on an intellectual basis, my emotion is into this now, or I'm overly emotive. It means I think my ego is being attacked. Many times I've seen people who don't pray, don't fast, are irreligious in every sense of the word, but when Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam is challenged, Suddenly they're overheated. What does this mean? This means the ego has formed an identity with this Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam, even if Imam alayhi salam himself was far beyond and far distant from what they might be practicing. But once he is challenged or his authority is challenged, this person's ego is challenged. And more recently, perhaps we find religious theories that have not been heard of before. Very recently, in the month of Ramadan, some mujtahideen came out with fatwa about shortening the fast, for example, in this context, in the Western context, or even some other mujtahideen said something about the ability to drink water in extreme circumstances without going into the details of what the fatwa was, or the hukm was. Suddenly, how can you say this? You know what the argument was? How can you say this is not an academic argument or an intellectual argument? We've never heard of this thing before. We've been living here for 30 years now in the West. We've never heard this before. Islam has been practiced. The Mujtahids have never ruled like this before. We've never heard this before is also not an intellectual argument. I'm not saying we might agree or disagree with the fatwa itself. That's a different matter. But we've never heard of this before is not an argument, a logical argument. In fact, this argument was posed and was made by the ones who opposed Musa alayhi salam. In Surah Qasas, we find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes those who were in opposition to Musa alayhi salam. فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُم مُوسَى بِآيَاتِنَا بَيِّنَاتٍ. When Musa brought our signs clearly, قَالُوا مَا هَذَا إِلَّا سِحْرٌ مُفْتَرًى. They said, first of all, this is nothing but some fabricated magic. Fine, also this was just accusations. There wasn't not an intellectual argument. But what do they bring as their argument against? وَمَا سَمِعْنَا بِهَذَا فِي آبَائِنَا الْأَوَّلِينَ. Also, we haven't heard of this before from our forefathers. So if someone comes with something new that we may not have heard of from our fathers or forefathers, does that make the view itself wrong? It's contravening what's been said before. Al-Junaidi thought he was teaching our Imam alayhi salam something which he brought with him from his fathers and forefathers and his teachers. Imam alayhi salam gave him something even more. And Al-Junaidi said, this is incredible that I'm learning from him. People think that I'm teaching, but by Allah I'm learning from him. So things may contravene what's gone before. It may be controversial. We don't say new anymore because new has a good connotation behind it. Something new is good. It's novel. No, we say controversial means it's contravening what's gone before. It gives it a negative connotation. It might be controversial, certain fatwa, certain ideas. But does that mean it's wrong? Something controversial, does that mean it's wrong? The Prophet ﷺ was the first controversial person if we look at Islam, because he was contravening what was there already, the idol worship. Does that mean he was wrong? No. But if someone opens their mind and opens the aql, gives it the freedom to grow and to think and to make the right judgment call, instead of basing their judgments on who is saying something, for example, we have self-help books written by Buddhists, Swamis, Hindus, other religions which are linked to the spiritual realm. We don't agree with their theology. Okay, does that mean I can't take anything from the book? Or do we follow what Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam says? لا تنظر إلى من قال. Don't look at who's saying it or who's speaking. وانظر إلى ما قال. Look at what's being said. Be it a Muslim or non-Muslim, be it a Wahhabi, Salafi, Sufi, Sunni, Shia, Ala, who cares? If they're saying something beneficial, I'll take it. And if they're saying whatever is not beneficial, I'll leave it. Why not take from someone who I may not agree with his theology or even his jurisprudence? Even if I agree with his theology, I don't agree with his jurisprudence or political ideologies. So I can't take anything in the banning culture that we live in today, because this book says this about Imam Mahdi, Ajallahu Ta'ala Farajuh Sharif, ban the book, ban the person, ban the book, ban. No. That's not the teaching of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Rather, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says something completely opposite. Al-hikmatu, he says, ضَالَةُ الْمُؤْمِنِ. Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. فَحَيْثُمَا وَجَدَ أَحَدُكُمْ ضَالَّتَهُ فَلْيَأْخُذْهَا. Wherever a person sees their lost property, he should take it. Did the Prophet not say study or gain knowledge even from China? China was not a Muslim nation at that time. So instead of judging things by who's written or what's written or which theology they follow, they're a Hindu, they're a Buddhist, I can take things from everywhere as long as I'm benefiting. This mujtahid or that mujtahid, whether he believes in or he ascribes to the ideology of Wiladat al-Faqih, or he's against it, or he's completely opposed to it, I don't care. If he's saying something beneficial. There was a scholar who was debating, a Shia scholar, debating with someone from the non-Shia denomination. One of his students saw him reading the book of a non-Shia scholar. And the student wrote to the teacher. He said, how is it that I find you reading this kind of book? From non-Shia, I mean, we have so much from the Shia, why does he have to read this kind of book? The teacher replied to his letter. He said to him, أَنَا أَنظُرُ إِلَى مَا قِيلَ وَلَيْسَ إِلَى مَنْ قَالَ. First of all, I look at what's being said. Not at who's saying it. It might be Shia or non-Shia. But I look at what's being said first of all. Beyond this, كما أني لست ممن ينظر إلى دين ومذهب ومعتقد الكاتب قبل أن أنظر إلى المكتوب. I'm not the kind of person who straight away looks at, this person is of this religion, or this denomination, or he has this theology, and therefore I reject the whole book. I'm not that kind of person. First I look at what's being said, what's written there. Then I'll make my judgments. And furthermore, even if what's being said, 80% of it may be disagreeable against the theology that I have, and I disagree with it, and I prove my arguments against it, this book, does that mean I ban the book or I put it to one side, never to be looked at again? He said, I'm also not that kind of person. وَلَسْتُ مِمَّنْ إِمَّا أَن يُؤْمِنَ بِالْمُطْلَقِ أو يُكْفَرْ بِالْمُطْلَقِ. I'm also not that kind of person who either he believes something completely because this is from my creed, so all of this book makes complete sense. No. Or this is against my creed, so the whole book is nonsense. No. I'm not that kind of person. Even if I can take 5% of the book, the rest of it is nonsense, I'll take that 5%. Or just because Shaykh X or Ayatollah Y has said it, everything in it must be right and I take the whole, I have my freedom to disagree. However, when, as we mentioned, the ego forms that identity with my theology or with my ideology, with my jurisprudential adherence, then when someone comes and speaks against that, I may think I've studied and I've learnt and I've got this degree and that degree in BA, MA, PhD and beyond, and professor. But as long as that ego is attached to my way of thinking, I'm unable to move outside that, I'm still caged. I'm still caged. The aql is still not free to fly. It's confined. If I haven't studied at all and I only know what I've been told, I've got no education, no study, nothing, and my cage is very small, I don't fly anywhere. But if I've been educated and accumulated certain degrees and wear different colored turbans and I may be educated, that means my cage is much bigger, the size of this room and beyond. But still, whereas my ego is attached to what I think I know, there comes a time where I fly to the bounds of that room and hit the edge of it and I find out I'm still caged. No matter how big the cage is, the bird, we see these birds flying, migrating from one continent to the next continent. Flying from where they're supposed to fly, landing exactly where they're supposed to land. Innately, that bird knows where to go if you let it free. If you let it go, the aql knows where to go. The aql, remember we mentioned that the aql is that entity which is obedient to Allah, which is accountable, which is over and above wrongdoing, which is that thing which prompts a person towards doing good, which is at-tajannub min al-ithm, which is staying away from sinning. All the hadith. The aql is this: if it's left free to fly. If it's caged, however, then we hinder it from flying. Sometimes we hinder our own bird from flying. Sometimes we cage the intellects of others from flying. When new ideas come, new jurisprudential opinions come, as we had in the month of Ramadan recently, we mentioned, for example. But we shouldn't say them. We shouldn't mention these. Why? Because our youth will become confused. Because our youth are too stupid to think for themselves. So we cage that all they know is there's only one person who we're meant to follow and there's only one opinion available out there. No. The aql knows where to go if you let it fly, if you let it free, if we destroy our ego which is attached to that identity, if we open up that cage, as Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says, describing the situation, كَم مِّنْ عَقْلٍ أَسِيرٍ. How many imprisoned, again I don't like the word intellect to substitute for aql, but how many aql there is imprisoned تحت هوى أمير, which under the ruling of whimsical desires or the egoistic desires, which is imprisoning and ruling over it. So how is that bird let free then? I'm sure you may have heard the story because other speakers have also mentioned this parable of the merchant who had a beautiful bird caged. The merchant treated the bird very well because it was his favorite bird. Fed it and let it drink water whenever required, and it was kept but it was caged. The bird's want is to be free, like the aql's innate nature is to be free, and it knows where to fly, like the bird flying from one continent to the exact location in the other continent it's supposed to go. The aql knows how to get to Allah, because we say, as the Imam alayhi salam said in that narration we mentioned before, when Allah created the aql, قال له أقبل فأقبل ثم قال أدبر فأدبر. He told the aql, come, it came. He told it, now go back. It's obedient to Allah if we let it free. So this bird, the merchant's bird, wanted to be free. The merchant didn't want to let the bird free. He loved the bird. He fed it, he gave it water, he gave it everything. It was looked after. So every day the merchant would ask the bird, what is it that you want? What can I give you more than this? The bird said, nothing, I just want to be free. The merchant couldn't do this day after day. Once the merchant was going on a trip, on a business trip, he told the bird, I'm going for a few days, I'm crossing that forest from where I caught you in the first place, I trapped you. Your relatives also live in that forest. Is there anything you want to pass a message to them, to your relatives in the forest? I said, yeah, nothing, just tell them about my plight, that I'm caged and I want to be free. That's all I want to pass to them as a message. Just tell them that. And tell me what their response is. The merchant said, fine. He went to the forest and he called out to the birds, those birds which were the same feathers as this bird came. He said, such and such bird I've caged in my house. I love the bird. And that bird just wants me to pass you a message that he's in this imprisoned state and he doesn't like that state. He's sorrowful, and I said he wants to be free. As soon as one bird heard about the plight of its cousin, it shrieked from the branch and fell dead to the floor. Seeing this, the second bird also shouted in agony and fell dead to the floor. And one by one, all the birds on the branches cried out and fell to the floor, dead. The merchant was shocked. What have I done? As it is, I've imprisoned that bird. Now I've killed all of his cousins as well. What am I going to go back and tell that bird? I have to do what the bird said. His only wish was that, tell me their reaction. On the way back from the business trip, he came back home. The bird asked, what is the news from my relatives in the forest? He said, he doesn't know. I want to know what was their reaction. What did you tell them about my plight? The merchant said, I told them. I said, what was their reaction? So as soon as I told them, one bird cried out from the top of the branch in agony and fell to the floor dead. Then a second, then a third, until all of them died. On hearing this, the bird in the cage cried out in agony and fell to the bottom of the cage and died. The merchant is now in immense grief. I killed all of those birds, and making my own bird that I loved, hearing about their agony, this one is also dead. So he went to bury the bird. He went to bury the bird, so he opened the cage to bury the bird. As soon as he opened the door of the cage, the bird flew. The bird flew to the branches and was free. The merchant said, I don't understand. He said, you don't understand. When you told my cousins, my relatives about my plight, they were giving me a message that in order to be free, you have to die. In order to be free, you have to die. Your freedom lies in your death. The freedom of the aql, which we've made analogous to the bird, lies in the death of one's own ego. When we detach and kill that ego, that is my identity, that I am Shia, muqallid of this person, and I follow these books, and I follow this Quran, and this is all I have, and nothing else, and that's me. If anyone attacks this, that's attacking me. Once I kill that, my aql will be free. Once I kill that attitude, then I can fly. Once I can entertain someone else's opinion, whether I reject it afterwards or I agree with it, whether I endorse it or I discuss it. Once that ego is dead, that any attack, intellectual, academic attack against my theology, against my ideology, against my denominational creed, it's not an attack on me. And I can respond. And at the end of the day, I may well be wrong. And I'll accept the stronger view. The person who traverses towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Salik, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, says about that person. قال الإمام علي عليه السلام عن السالك, says about this person, that person who's going to Allah, قد أحيا عقله. That person has enlivened or given life to their aql. I don't want to use the word intellect anymore. وَأَمَاتَ نَفْسَهُ. And in doing so has killed that carnal self, that egoistic self. So, running short of time, let me conclude by recapping whatever we've discussed today. The aql, again, now let's move away from using the word intellect, being not a wholly accurate translation. The aql, first of all, we mentioned the hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, is the lamp for the human kingdom in the heart. If that lamp is not given the freedom to be bright, it'll make the human heart gloomy. 2, according to the narrations, the aql is not what we understand to be intelligence, that a person can intellectualize 1 + 1 = 2, 10 + 10 = 20. It's something well beyond this. It's not the accumulation of scientific or degrees in the humanities, etc. It's something well beyond this. It's a spiritual entity that obeys Allah. Number 3, it's obedient to Allah. It is the basis for accountability. It is that thing which prompts towards good and is far above evil doing. It is the opposition to one's desires. And it is that thing, as Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam says, التجنب من الإثم. It's that thing which keeps away or abstains from sin. Number 4, the aql is often not free. It's often imprisoned by the way we think, by our ego, by our moods, by the different things which we let affect us in making our judgments. Number 5, the aql, when it is subjected to a fanatical way of thinking, the person who has that aql often loses the benefit of the wisdom that might be out there because of their narrow-mindedness. Number 6, the aql, we made it comparable to the bird, which knows where to go, because aql is obedient to Allah, which can migrate from one continent to another thousands of miles, and it knows where to land. The aql knows how to obey Allah if it is let free. And number 7, the aql is freed through the death of the carnal desires or the egoistic soul. So on that note, on this occasion whereby we celebrate the birth of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, who was known for his intellect and his flourishing intellect, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this night that He gives us the tawfiq to follow in His footsteps, that we allow our aql to be free, take from anywhere where we can get benefit, and inshallah that way become like that bird that soars to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.